The dusty stagecoach rolled into Copper Creek just as the sun began its descent behind the jagged mountains that surrounded the small frontier town. Clara Whitmore pressed her face against the grimy window, watching the wooden buildings and dirt streets pass by. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she clutched the worn letter in her gloved hands. After 3 weeks of traveling from Boston, she had finally arrived to meet the man who would become her husband. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the general store, and Clara took a deep breath. She had answered Thomas Mitchell's advertisement in the matrimonial newspaper 6 months ago. His letters had been kind and thoughtful, describing his cattle ranch and his need for a wife to help manage his household. What he hadn't mentioned in detail was his 10-year-old son, Samuel, who had lost his mother 2 years earlier. The driver opened the door and helped Clara down from the coach. She smoothed her dark blue traveling dress and adjusted her bonnet, trying to look presentable after the long journey. The town was smaller than she had expected, with maybe 50 buildings scattered along the main street. Cowboys and ranchers moved about their business, some tipping their hats politely when they noticed her. "You must be Miss Whitmore," came a deep voice behind her. Clara turned to see a tall man approaching. He wore clean work clothes and a black hat, and his face was weathered by years of outdoor work. But this wasn't Thomas Mitchell. The man was too young, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair and serious brown eyes. "I'm James Mitchell," he said, removing his hat. "Thomas Mitchell's son." "My father sent me to collect you." Clara's confusion must have shown on her face because James quickly explained. "Pa's feeling poorly today. Nothing serious, just a touch of the fever. He didn't want to delay your arrival, so he asked me to bring you out to the ranch." She nodded, though something felt strange about the situation. In all of Thomas's letters, he had mentioned his son Samuel, but never an adult son named James. Perhaps James was from a previous marriage, or maybe Thomas had simply forgotten to mention him in their correspondence. James loaded her trunk and carpet bag into a sturdy wagon, while Clara climbed onto the bench seat. As they rode out of town toward the ranch, James proved to be a quiet companion. He answered her questions about the area and the ranch, but he seemed distracted, glancing at her sideways when he thought she wasn't looking. The Mitchell Ranch appeared after about an hour of riding through rolling grassland dotted with cattle. It was larger than Clara had expected, with a substantial 2-story house, a large barn, and several outbuildings. Horses grazed in a nearby paddock, and she could see men working with the cattle in the distance. As the wagon pulled up to the house, a young boy burst through the front door. This had to be Samuel, Thomas's son. He had sandy brown hair and bright blue eyes, and he looked exactly as his father had described him in his letters. "Is that her? Is that my new mama?" Samuel called out, running toward the wagon. "Slow down, Sam," James said, but there was warmth in his voice as he watched the boy approach. Clara climbed down from the wagon with James's help, and Samuel skidded to a stop in front of her. He looked her up and down with the frank curiosity of a child. "You're prettier than I thought you'd be," Samuel announced. "Pa said you were nice looking, but you're really pretty." Clara laughed, charmed by the boy's honesty. "Thank you, Samuel. You look just like your father described you in his letters." Samuel beamed and grabbed her hand. "Come on. Pa's waiting inside. He's been nervous as a cat all day." James carried her bags as Samuel led Clara toward the house. The building was well constructed and clearly built to last. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and Clara could see lace curtains in the windows. Someone had been taking good care of the place. The front door opened before they reached it, and a man stepped out onto the porch. Clara stopped walking, her breath catching in her throat. The man before her was not the Thomas Mitchell she had been expecting to meet. In his letters, Thomas had described himself as a man of 52 years, with graying hair and a weathered face. The man on the porch was perhaps 35 at most, with thick brown hair and a strong, lean build. He was handsome in a rugged way, with kind eyes and a nervous smile. "Miss Whitmore," he said, stepping forward and removing his hat. "I'm Thomas Mitchell. Welcome to the ranch." Clara stared at him, her mind racing. This couldn't be right. The man before her looked nothing like she had imagined from his letters. He was far too young, too vital, too different from the older widower she had been corresponding with. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "You're not what I expected." Thomas's face flushed red, and he glanced nervously at James and Samuel. "Perhaps we should go inside and talk. You must be tired from your journey." The interior of the house was comfortable and clean, with good furniture and feminine touches that suggested a woman's hand in the decorating. Samuel chattered excitedly as he showed Clara around, pointing out his room and the kitchen where she would cook. James followed silently, and Thomas seemed increasingly uncomfortable. Finally, Clara could no longer contain her confusion. When they were all gathered in the main room, she turned to face Thomas directly. "Mr. Mitchell, I must ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. In your letters, you described yourself quite differently. You said you were 52 years old, and you wrote about having gray hair and a face marked by years of hard work." "The man I see before me is clearly much younger." Thomas looked down at his hands, then glanced at James with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. Samuel looked back and forth between the adults, sensing the tension but not understanding it. "There's something I need to tell you," Thomas said finally. "Something I should have explained in my letters, but I was afraid you wouldn't come if you knew the truth." Clara sat down in one of the chairs, her legs suddenly feeling weak. "What truth?" Thomas took a deep breath. "I'm not the one who wrote those letters to you. My father did." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. "Your father?" "Pa died 3 months ago," James said quietly from across the room. "Heart gave out while he was working with the horses." Clara's mind reeled. "Then who wrote the last letters?" "I received correspondence just 6 weeks ago, confirming my travel arrangements." Thomas looked miserable. "I did. After Pa died, I found all the letters you two had been exchanging. He had told me about you, about his plan to find a wife through the matrimonial paper. He had been so excited about your coming, and he had already sent you the money for travel." "I don't understand," Clara said, feeling dizzy. "If your father was the one seeking a wife, and he's deceased, then why am I here? Why did you continue the correspondence?" Samuel piped up from where he sat near the fireplace. "Because Pa said we needed a mama. And James needs a wife too, but he's too shy to find one himself." James's face turned bright red. "Samuel, that's enough." But the boy continued, oblivious to the adult's discomfort. "Grandpa said Clara would be perfect for our family. He said she sounded kind and smart and would take good care of all of us." Clara looked around the room at the 3 males who had become her responsibility through this strange deception. Thomas looked ashamed but hopeful. James appeared mortified by his younger brother's words. And Samuel seemed genuinely excited about the prospect of having a mother figure in his life. "So, let me understand this correctly," Clara said slowly. "Your father, the elder Thomas Mitchell, placed the advertisement and began corresponding with me. He described himself accurately in his letters. But when he died, you, his son, took over the correspondence and convinced me to come here anyway, knowing that I was expecting to marry an older man." Thomas nodded miserably. "I know how it sounds. I know it was wrong to deceive you, but Pa had already sent you the travel money, and you had already made plans to come. And Samuel has been so excited about having a mother again. I thought maybe when you met us, you might consider staying anyway." "And what exactly would my position be here?" Clara asked. "Am I expected to marry you instead of your father? Or am I simply to be a housekeeper and caretaker for Samuel?" "I hoped you might consider marrying me," Thomas said quietly. I know it's not what you planned, and I'm not the man you were expecting. But I can provide for you, and I think we could build a good life together. Samuel needs a mother, and I could use a partner in running this ranch." Clara stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the vast landscape beyond the house. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She had traveled 3 weeks to reach this place, leaving behind her life in Boston and her job as a seamstress. She had few options if she chose to leave. But more than that, she found herself genuinely touched by the situation. The elder Thomas had clearly been a thoughtful man who had seen an opportunity to help his family even after his death. His letters had been warm and intelligent, and she had grown fond of him through their correspondence. The son seemed to share many of his father's qualities. "May I ask you something, Thomas?" she said, still looking out the window. "Of course." "In your father's letters, he wrote about his hopes and dreams for this ranch and for Samuel's future. He wrote about wanting a partner who would share in building something lasting here. Do you share those same goals?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Yes, I do. This ranch meant everything to my father, and it means everything to me too. And Samuel is the most important thing in my life. Everything I do is for his future." Clara turned from the window to study Thomas's face. She saw sincerity there, and kindness, and the same gentle strength that had come through in his father's written words. James stood near the doorway, watching the exchange with obvious concern for his brother. "And you, James," Clara said, addressing the older son. "What is your role in this family? Are you a partner in the ranch, or do you work elsewhere?" James shifted uncomfortably. "I'm Thomas's older brother, actually, not his son. I work the ranch with him. We're equal partners in everything here." This revelation added another layer to Clara's confusion. "So you're both sons of the elder Thomas Mitchell? You're both adults and you both run this ranch together?" "That's right," Thomas said. "James is 32 and I'm 29. We've been working this land together since we were boys. When Pa died, we inherited it jointly." Clara looked around the room again, reassessing the situation. Here were 2 capable men and 1 young boy, all trying to make a life on this frontier ranch. The elder Thomas had clearly been thinking of their collective welfare when he had reached out to find a wife through the matrimonial service. "I need some time to think about all of this," Clara said finally. "This is not at all what I expected when I agreed to come here. I was prepared to marry a man 20 years older than myself and help him raise his young son. Instead, I find myself in the middle of a family of 3, with one man hoping I'll marry him, and another man who seems equally uncomfortable with the entire situation." Samuel jumped up from his spot by the fireplace. "But you can't leave. Grandpa promised you'd stay and be our family. He said you'd teach me to read better and help with the cooking and make this house feel like a home again." Clara's heart softened as she looked at the earnest young face. "I'm not saying I'm leaving, Samuel. I'm just saying I need to understand what everyone expects of me before I make any decisions." Thomas stepped forward. "You can have the guest room upstairs for as long as you need to decide. There's no pressure for you to marry anyone right away. Maybe you could just stay for a while, get to know us, see if you think you could build a life here." James nodded in agreement. "We could certainly use help around the house and with Samuel. If you decided to stay, even just as a housekeeper and teacher for the boy, we'd be grateful. The marriage question could be something you think about later if you wanted." Clara considered their words. She had very little money left after her travels, and she had no family back in Boston to return to. The job she had left at the dress shop had already been filled by another woman. In many ways, she had burned her bridges when she decided to answer the matrimonial advertisement. "May I ask what happened to Samuel's mother?" she said. Thomas's face grew sad. "She died in childbirth 2 years ago, along with the baby she was carrying. It's been hard on all of us, but especially on Samuel. He barely remembers her now, but he knows he's missing something that other children have." And neither of you has considered marriage before this? James spoke up. Thomas was married to Samuel's mother. I've never been married. There aren't many single women in this area, and ranching doesn't leave much time for courting. Clara walked back to the window as full darkness settled over the landscape. The house felt warm and welcoming, and despite the confusion of her situation, she found herself drawn to these people. The elder Thomas's letters had given her a sense of belonging to something larger than herself, and that feeling hadn't entirely disappeared even with this revelation. I'll stay for 2 weeks, she said finally. That will give me time to get to know all of you and understand what life would be like here. At the end of 2 weeks, I'll make a decision about whether to stay permanently, and if so, under what arrangements. Samuel whooped with joy and ran to hug her around the waist. Thank you, Miss Clara. You're going to love it here. I just know it. Thomas smiled with obvious relief. Thank you for giving us a chance. I know this isn't what you expected, but I hope you'll find that we can offer you a good life here. James stepped forward and offered his hand. Welcome to the Mitchell Ranch, Miss Whitmore. I hope these 2 weeks will give you a true picture of what we're like as a family. As Clara shook his hand, she noticed that his grip was firm and calloused from hard work, and his eyes were kind, despite his obvious discomfort with the situation. She found herself wondering what role he might play in her future if she decided to stay. The evening passed quietly as they shared a simple dinner that James had prepared. Clara learned that both brothers were capable cooks and housekeepers, having managed on their own since their father's death. Samuel chattered throughout the meal, telling Clara about his favorite horse, his school lessons, and his plans to become a great rancher like his father and uncle. After Samuel went to bed, the 3 adults sat in the main room talking. Thomas explained more about the ranch operations and their plans for expansion. James spoke about the challenges of raising cattle in this area and their hopes for building the largest herd in the county. Both men were clearly intelligent and hard-working, and Clara began to understand why the elder Thomas had been so proud of his sons. As the evening wore on, Clara found herself relaxing for the first time since her arrival. Despite the deception that had brought her here, she sensed that these were good people who were trying to build something meaningful in this harsh frontier landscape. The question was whether she could find her place among them, and if so, what that place would be. When she finally retired to the guest room upstairs, Clara stood at the window looking out at the star-filled sky. The silence of the countryside was complete, except for the distant lowing of cattle and the soft sounds of the house settling around her. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace and possibility. The next morning would begin her 2-week trial period with the Mitchell family. She would learn their routines, understand their struggles, and discover whether the life they offered could become the life she wanted. The elder Thomas's plan had brought her here under false pretenses, but perhaps his instincts about what his family needed had been correct after all. As she prepared for sleep, Clara thought about the letters that had brought her to this place. The elder Thomas had written about hope and partnership and building something lasting. Those dreams hadn't died with him. They lived on in his sons and grandson, waiting for someone willing to help make them real. Clara woke before dawn to the sound of boots on the wooden floor downstairs and the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance. She dressed quickly in her simplest dress and pinned her hair back, then made her way to the kitchen where she found James already preparing coffee over the stove. "Good morning," he said quietly, glancing up from his work. "You're up early for someone who just traveled 3 weeks to get here." "I've always been an early riser," Clara replied. "In Boston, I had to be at the dress shop by 7 each morning. Old habits stay with you." James poured her a cup of coffee and handed it to her. "Thomas is already out checking the cattle in the north pasture. He'll be back for breakfast in about an hour. Samuel usually sleeps until the sun comes up." Clara sipped the strong coffee and looked around the kitchen. It was clean and well organized, but she could see areas where a woman's touch would make a difference. The curtains needed mending, and the pantry could use better organization. Small tasks, but ones that would make daily life easier for the family. "What can I do to help with breakfast?" she asked. James seemed surprised by the offer. "You don't need to work on your first morning here. You're supposed to be getting used to the place." "I'd rather be useful than idle," Clara said firmly. "Besides, I want to understand how your household operates." For the next hour, Clara worked alongside James to prepare breakfast. She learned that he was indeed an excellent cook, having taken over most of the food preparation since his father's death. But she also noticed that he approached cooking like a chore to be completed efficiently, without the small touches that made meals special. When Thomas returned from his morning rounds, he found Clara and James working together in easy companionship. She was frying eggs while James prepared fresh biscuits, and they were discussing the best ways to preserve vegetables for the winter months. "This is nice," Thomas said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "It's been a long time since this kitchen felt like the heart of the house." Samuel thundered down the stairs shortly after, his hair sticking up in all directions and his shirt half-buttoned. "Miss Clara, you're still here. I thought maybe you might have left in the night." "I gave you my word that I'd stay for 2 weeks," Clara said, smoothing down the boy's hair. "I always keep my promises." Over breakfast, Clara learned more about the ranch operations. The Mitchell spread covered nearly 3,000 acres, with about 800 head of cattle. They employed 6 full-time ranch hands, and during busy seasons like roundup and branding, they hired additional temporary workers. The nearest neighbors were 5 miles away, and the town of Copper Creek was the closest community of any size. "It's a lonely life sometimes," Thomas admitted, "especially during the winter months when travel becomes difficult. Pa always said that was why he wanted to find a wife, not just for the companionship, but to make this place feel less isolated." After breakfast, Thomas suggested that Clara tour the ranch with him to get a better understanding of their operations. James would stay with Samuel to work on the boys' lessons, since the schoolhouse in town was too far for daily travel. The morning tour revealed the impressive scope of the Mitchell Ranch. Clara rode alongside Thomas on a gentle mare named Buttercup, and he showed her the various pastures, the breeding areas, and the network of water sources that kept the operation running. She could see that both brothers had inherited their father's skill for ranching, and that they had expanded the operation significantly since taking control. "James is actually better with the cattle than I am," Thomas told her as they rode. "He has an instinct for knowing when an animal is sick or when a cow is about to calve. I'm better with the business side, dealing with buyers, managing the accounts, planning for the future." Clara noticed how Thomas spoke of his brother with genuine admiration rather than jealousy. "You two work well together." "We always have. Pa raised us to be partners rather than competitors. He said there was room enough on this land for both of us to build good lives, as long as we worked together instead of against each other." They stopped for lunch by a creek that ran through the eastern section of the ranch. Thomas had brought sandwiches and fresh apples, and they sat in the shade of a large cottonwood tree while their horses grazed nearby. The setting was peaceful, with the sound of running water and the gentle breeze rustling through the leaves. "Can I ask you something personal?" Clara said as they ate. "Of course. When your father was writing those letters to me, did you know about his plans? Did you help him compose them?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I knew he was corresponding with someone, but I didn't know the details until after he died. When I found all the letters, I was amazed at how well he had come to know you through your exchanges. He talked about you often in those last months, but he never told us your name or that you had agreed to come." Clara pulled the original letters from her reticule and handed them to Thomas. "Would you mind reading some of these? I'd like to know if the man who wrote them sounds like your father." Thomas took the letters carefully and began reading. As he progressed through them, Clara watched his face change from curiosity to amazement to something approaching wonder. "This is exactly how Pa talked," he said finally. "These words, these ideas, I can hear his voice in every sentence. He was always saying that the right partner could make a good life into a great one, and that shared dreams were stronger than individual ambitions." Clara took the letters back and held them gently. He wrote about wanting to build something lasting, something that would survive long after he was gone. He said he wanted a wife who would become part of the ranch's future, not just a helpmate for his remaining years. "That sounds like Pa," Thomas agreed. He was always thinking about legacy, about what would happen to this land after he was gone. He wanted to make sure James and Samuel and I would have everything we needed to succeed. As they rode back toward the house, Clara found herself thinking about the elder Thomas's motivations. His letters had painted a picture of a man who understood that building a life on the frontier required more than just individual strength. It required community, partnership, and long-term thinking. The afternoon brought new challenges when one of the ranch hands rode up to report problems with a section of fence in the southern pasture. Cattle had broken through and were wandering toward the neighbor's property. Thomas and James would need to spend the rest of the day rounding up the strays and repairing the damage. "I'm sorry," Thomas told Clara. "This isn't how I wanted your first day to go. We'll probably be working until dark." "What can I do to help?" Clara asked. James looked surprised. "You don't need to work cattle, Miss Whitmore. That's hard, dirty work." "I don't mean with the cattle," Clara clarified. "But Samuel will need supervision and dinner will need to be prepared. I can handle the household tasks while you two deal with the emergency." Both brothers looked at her with new respect. In their experience, town women often expected to be waited on rather than contributing to the work of ranch life. Clara spent the afternoon with Samuel, helping him with his reading and arithmetic while also exploring the house more thoroughly. She found the elder Thomas's study, which had been left largely untouched since his death. The room was filled with books on ranching, agriculture, and animal husbandry, as well as carefully maintained records of the ranch's operations. "Grandpa loved this room," Samuel told her as they looked around. "He said knowledge was the most important tool a rancher could have." Clara examined the bookshelf and was impressed by the scope of the elder Thomas's interests. Along with practical texts on livestock and farming, she found books on philosophy, history, and even poetry. One volume caught her eye, a collection of letters between John and Abigail Adams. Inside the front cover, someone had written in careful handwriting, "The best marriages are partnerships of mind and spirit as well as heart." She was still reading when Thomas and James returned after sunset, dusty and exhausted from their work. Clara had dinner ready, beef stew made from ingredients she found in the pantry, fresh bread, and apple pie using fruit from the ranch's small orchard. "This is incredible," James said after tasting the stew. "How did you manage to prepare all this while watching Samuel?" "Samuel helped," Clara said, smiling at the boy. "He's quite good at peeling potatoes and setting the table." Samuel beamed with pride. "Miss Clara said I was the best kitchen helper she'd ever worked with." Over dinner, the brothers described their afternoon's work. The fence repair had been more complicated than expected, and they had spent hours tracking down all the stray cattle. But the crisis had reminded them of how much they relied on each other during difficult times. "That's the thing about ranch life," Thomas explained to Clara. "No matter how well you plan, there's always something unexpected happening. Weather, sick animals, equipment problems, market changes. You have to be ready to adapt quickly. And you have to trust the people you work with," James added. "When 20 head of cattle are heading toward the neighbor's prize bull, you don't have time for long discussions. You need to know that everyone will do their part without being asked." Clara listened thoughtfully. Your father wrote about that in one of his letters. He said frontier life required people who could think on their feet and work as a team. After Samuel went to bed, the three adults sat on the front porch enjoying the cool evening air. The sky was clear, and the stars seemed impossibly bright after Clara's years in the city. She found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "Can I ask you both something?" she said after a while. "Sure," Thomas replied. "When your father died, did you consider selling the ranch and moving somewhere with more opportunities? A place where you could meet wives more easily? Where Samuel could attend better schools?" James and Thomas exchanged glances. "We talked about it," James admitted. "There were offers on the land, good ones. We could have taken the money and started over anywhere we wanted." "But this is home," Thomas continued. "This is what Pa spent his life building, and it's what we want to spend our lives improving. The land, the cattle, the way of life. It's all part of who we are." Clara nodded slowly. That's what came through in his letters. He wasn't just looking for a housekeeper or even a companion. He was looking for someone who would see this place the way he did, someone who would want to be part of building something bigger than any individual person. "Exactly," James said. "Pa always said that the right woman would see the potential here, not just the isolation and hard work." The next few days fell into a comfortable routine. Clara rose early to help with breakfast and household tasks, spent mornings learning about the ranch operations, dedicated afternoons to working with Samuel on his education, and prepared elaborate dinners for the family. She found herself genuinely enjoying the work and the company. Samuel proved to be a bright child who was eager to learn. Clara discovered that he could already read simple books, but he struggled with arithmetic and had never been exposed to geography or history beyond basic local knowledge. She began creating lesson plans that would expand his education while keeping him engaged. James continued to be quietly helpful and competent. But Clara sensed a reserved quality in him that went beyond natural shyness. He seemed to be holding himself back from becoming too invested in her presence at the ranch. When she tried to engage him in longer conversations, he would politely redirect the discussion to practical matters or excuse himself to attend to ranch business. Thomas, on the other hand, was clearly making an effort to court her in traditional ways. He brought her wildflowers, offered to show her the most scenic parts of the ranch, and engaged her in long conversations about books, philosophy, and their hopes for the future. Clara found him genuinely attractive and intelligent, but she sensed that his interest in her was more practical than passionate. On her 5th day at the ranch, Clara made a discovery that changed her understanding of the family dynamic. While organizing the elder Thomas's study, she found a packet of letters hidden behind other documents in the desk drawer. These were not her letters to the elder Thomas, but correspondence between the father and a lawyer in Denver. The letters discussed the elder Thomas's will and his concerns about his son's futures. In one letter, dated just 2 months before his death, he wrote, "My greatest worry is that James will sacrifice his own happiness for his younger brother's welfare. He has already given up so much to help raise Samuel and build this ranch. I fear that if I die without ensuring that both my boys have the opportunity for marriage and family, James will spend the rest of his life as a bachelor uncle, working to support Thomas's family instead of building his own." Another letter revealed even more surprising information. "I have been corresponding with a young woman from Boston who seems ideally suited to frontier life. My original plan was to marry her myself and provide a mother for Samuel. But I realize now that my time is limited, and my son's needs are greater than mine. If something happens to me, I hope this young woman will consider that both of my boys are worthy of marriage, not just Thomas." Clara sat back in the desk chair, her mind racing. The elder Thomas had been thinking about his son's individual needs, not just his own desire for companionship. His plan to bring her to the ranch had been designed to benefit both Thomas and James. even though only Thomas had continued the courtship. That evening, Clara observed the brothers more carefully during dinner. She noticed that James often deferred to Thomas in conversation, even when he clearly had strong opinions about the topics being discussed. When Samuel asked about plans for expanding the cattle herd, James had detailed ideas but waited for Thomas to speak first. When Clara complimented the meal preparation, James immediately credited Thomas with the best elements of the dinner, even though Clara had seen James do most of the cooking. After Samuel went to bed, Clara decided to address the situation directly. "James, can I ask you something personal?" she said as they all sat on the porch. James looked wary, but nodded. "I suppose. Do you think your father's plan to find a wife through the matrimonial service was a good idea?" "I think Pa wanted what was best for the family," James said carefully. "He always put our welfare above his own interests." "But what about your welfare specifically?" Clara pressed. "You're 32 years old, you're intelligent and capable, and you work as hard as anyone to make this ranch successful. Don't you think you deserve the chance to have a wife and family of your own?" James was quiet for so long that Clara wondered if he would answer at all. Finally, he said, "Thomas is Samuel's father. The boy needs stability and a mother figure. My personal desires are less important than Samuel's needs." Thomas had been listening to this exchange with growing discomfort. "James, that's not fair to yourself," he said. "You've already sacrificed years of your life helping me raise Samuel. I won't let you give up the chance of marriage for our sake." "It's not a sacrifice," James said firmly. "Samuel is my nephew, and I love him like my own son. This ranch is my home, too. I'm not giving up anything." Clara studied James's face in the dim porch light. She was beginning to understand the complex family dynamics that had developed since Thomas's wife died and left him to raise Samuel alone. James had stepped into the role of co-parent and uncle, helping to provide the stability that Samuel needed. But in doing so, he had postponed his own dreams of marriage and family. "James," Clara said gently, "what if there was a way for everyone to have what they needed? What if Samuel could have a mother figure and both you and Thomas could have the opportunity for marriage and family?" Both brothers stared at her, clearly confused by her suggestion. "I don't understand what you're getting at," Thomas said. Clara took a deep breath. She was about to propose something that would have been scandalous in Boston society, but frontier life required different solutions to complex problems. "What if we considered a different kind of arrangement?" she said slowly. "What if, instead of choosing between you two, we found a way to build a family that included all of us?" The silence that followed her words seemed to stretch on forever as both brothers tried to understand what she was suggesting. The morning after Clara's unexpected proposal brought an uncomfortable tension to the Mitchell household. Both brothers had retreated into polite formality, and even Samuel seemed to sense that something significant was hanging in the balance. Clara spent the early hours in the kitchen, preparing breakfast and trying to organize her thoughts about what she had suggested the night before. When James came downstairs for his usual early coffee, he moved carefully around the kitchen as if trying not to disturb her. Clara finally decided that the awkwardness needed to be addressed directly. "James, I want to apologize for last night," she said, not looking up from the eggs she was scrambling. "I think my words came out wrong, and I may have given you the impression that I was suggesting something improper." James poured his coffee and stood by the window, looking out at the dawn sky. "I'm not sure what you were suggesting, to be honest. It sounded like you thought both Thomas and I could somehow share a wife, which would be scandalous even by frontier standards." Clara turned to face him. "That's not what I meant, though I understand why it sounded that way. What I was trying to suggest is that there might be more than one solution to this family's needs." Before James could respond, Thomas came through the door with his arms full of fresh eggs from the chicken coop. He looked between Clara and James with obvious concern. "Good morning," he said carefully. "I hope everyone slept well." Clara could see that both brothers were walking on eggshells around her, trying to avoid saying anything that might prompt her to leave before her 2-week trial period was over. She realized that her poorly worded suggestion had made them both afraid of losing the stability she had brought to their household. "Sit down, both of you," she said firmly. "We need to clear the air about what I said last night, and I want to show you something I found in your father's papers." She retrieved the packet of letters she had discovered in the elder Thomas's study and placed them on the kitchen table. Both brothers looked at the familiar handwriting with surprise. "These are letters your father wrote to a lawyer in Denver about his will and his concerns for your futures," Clara explained. "I found them while organizing his study, and I think they reveal more about his plan than any of us initially understood." Thomas picked up the top letter and began reading while James looked over his shoulder. Clara watched their faces change from curiosity to amazement as they absorbed their father's words. "He was worried about both of us," James said quietly after they finished reading. "He didn't just want to find a mother for Samuel. He wanted to make sure we both had the opportunity for marriage and family." "Listen to this part," Thomas said, reading aloud from one of the letters. "I realize that bringing a wife to this ranch through matrimonial correspondence is unconventional, but frontier life requires unconventional solutions. My greatest hope is that the right woman will see that this family has room for multiple arrangements and that love and partnership can grow in unexpected ways." Clara nodded. "Your father was thinking several steps ahead. He knew his time was limited and he was trying to create opportunities for all of you, not just solve his own immediate needs." James sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs. "So, when you suggested a different kind of arrangement last night, you were thinking about Pa's original plan?" "Partly," Clara admitted, "but also about what I've observed during my week here. This ranch is large enough to support multiple families. There's room for Thomas to build a house of his own while still staying close enough to help with Samuel and the ranch operations. There's room for you to find a wife and start your own family without abandoning your responsibilities here." Thomas looked confused. "But what about you? We brought you here expecting that you would marry one of us. If we both pursue other wives, what becomes of your situation?" Clara had been thinking about this question for most of the night. "Your father's letters convinced me to come here because he wrote about building something lasting, something bigger than any individual person's desires. What if my role here isn't to marry either of you, but to help create the foundation for the kind of community he envisioned?" Before either brother could respond, Samuel came bounding down the stairs, his hair uncombed and his shirt half-buttoned as usual. The serious conversation immediately shifted to accommodate the boy's cheerful energy. "Morning, Miss Clara. Are you making pancakes today? James promised yesterday that we might have pancakes this morning." "I can certainly make pancakes," Clara said, grateful for the interruption. "Why don't you help me mix the batter while your father and uncle finish their discussion?" As Clara and Samuel worked together preparing breakfast, she listened to the brothers talking quietly at the table. They were processing their father's revealed intentions and trying to understand what options were now available to them. "The thing is," Thomas said, "I've come to care for Clara during this week, not just as a potential housekeeper or mother for Samuel, but as a person. The idea of her staying here just to help us find other wives doesn't sit right with me." James nodded. "I feel the same way. She's become part of this family already. Samuel adores her, and she's brought a warmth to this house that we've been missing since Ma died." Clara felt a flutter of emotion at their words, but she also sensed that they were still thinking about the situation in terms of traditional marriage arrangements. What she was beginning to envision was something more complex and potentially more fulfilling for everyone involved. After breakfast, Clara suggested that they all take a ride around the ranch together so she could share her ideas more completely. Samuel was excited about a family outing, and even James seemed willing to suspend his usual morning work to hear what she had to say. They rode to the highest point on the ranch property, a small hill that offered views of the entire spread. From this vantage point, Clara could see the main house, the barn and outbuildings, the various pastures, and the creek that ran through the eastern section of the land. "Your father owned all of this," she said, gesturing toward the vast landscape. 3,000 acres, enough to support several families if it's managed properly. Thomas nodded. "That's what Pa always said. He used to talk about this place becoming a real community someday, with multiple houses and families all working together." "What if we made that vision a reality?" Clara asked. "What if we used the resources your father left, combined with the skills and ambitions you both have, to create exactly the kind of settlement he imagined?" She pointed to a spot about half a mile from the main house where a grove of trees surrounded a natural spring. "That would be perfect for a second house. Close enough for easy cooperation, far enough away for privacy, and there's another good building site near the creek on the eastern border." James was beginning to understand her vision. "You're talking about building a small community right here on the ranch." "Exactly. Thomas, you could build a house for yourself and Samuel near the spring. You'd still be close enough to help with ranch operations, but you'd have your own space to grow your family. James, the eastern site would be perfect for you when you're ready to marry and start your own family." Samuel was listening intently from his position on his pony. "But what about you, Miss Clara? Where would you live in this plan?" Clara smiled at the boy's practical question. "I was thinking I could stay in the main house and serve as a kind of manager for the community. I could oversee the household operations, coordinate between the families, and ensure that your grandfather's dream of a lasting settlement becomes reality." Thomas dismounted from his horse and walked to the edge of the hill, looking down at the land with new eyes. "It could work," he said slowly. "The ranch generates enough income to support building projects like that. And having multiple families here would actually make the operation more efficient. Plus, it would solve the isolation problem," James added. "Instead of being alone out here, we'd have a real community. Samuel would grow up with cousins and neighbors. Not just cattle and ranch hands." Clara felt a surge of excitement as the brothers began to embrace her vision. But she also knew there were practical details that needed to be worked out. "There's something else," she said carefully. "I've been thinking about how to find wives for both of you, and I have some ideas about that too." She pulled out a letter from her reticule, one that she had written the night before after discovering the elder Thomas's papers. "I still have contacts in Boston, women who work in shops and factories, women who might be interested in frontier life if they knew what opportunities existed here. I could write to them, explain what we're building here, and see if any would be interested in corresponding with either of you." Thomas took the letter and read it carefully. Clara had written to her former supervisor at the dress shop, describing the Mitchell Ranch and asking if she knew any reliable women who might be interested in matrimonial correspondence with respectable ranchers. "This is thoughtful," Thomas said. "But what makes you think women from Boston would be interested in moving to a place this remote?" Clara smiled. "The same thing that made me interested. Your father's letters painted a picture of something worth building, something worth sacrificing city conveniences to be part of. If we can communicate that same vision to other women, I think we'll find some who share our dreams." James was studying the landscape with new interest. "We'd need to be careful about timing. It would take at least a year to build 2 new houses, and we'd want to make sure any women who came here understood exactly what they were getting into." "That's why I think correspondence would be important," Clara agreed. "We could take time to really get to know potential wives, make sure they understand frontier life, and share our vision for this community." Samuel had been listening to the adult conversation with growing excitement. "So I might have 2 new aunts, and maybe cousins someday?" "That's the idea," Clara said. "If your father and uncle both find good wives, And if those wives are willing to be part of building this community, then yes, you could have a much larger family. They spent the rest of the morning riding around the property, discussing practical details of Clara's proposal. Where exactly would the new houses be built? How would they coordinate ranch work between multiple households? What about schooling for future children? How would they share resources and responsibilities? By the time they returned to the main house for lunch, all three adults were genuinely excited about the possibilities. Samuel was already making plans for where he would build a fort when he had cousins to play with. But that afternoon brought a visitor who would test their new plans in an unexpected way. A well-dressed woman in her 30s arrived in a hired carriage from town, introducing herself as Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell from Denver. "I'm looking for the Mitchell Ranch," she said, when Thomas came out to greet her. "I believe you've been corresponding with my sister, Clara Whitmore." Clara's heart sank as she realized the implications of this visit. Mrs. Asmat Hartwell was clearly a respectable woman, probably married to a successful businessman, and she had come to check on her sister's welfare. "Clara is indeed here," Thomas said politely. "Would you like to come inside? I'm sure she'll be delighted to see you." Clara met her sister in the front parlor, and after initial greetings, Elizabeth got straight to the point of her visit. "I received your letter about traveling to Colorado to marry a rancher," Elizabeth said. "When I didn't hear from you after you should have arrived, I became concerned. I've come to make sure you're safe and to understand exactly what your situation is here." Clara explained the basic facts of what had happened, the elder Thomas's death, the deception about her intended husband's identity, and her decision to stay for a trial period to evaluate her options. "So, you're not married yet?" Elizabeth asked. "No. I'm still considering what course of action would be best." Elizabeth looked around the comfortable parlor, taking note of the quality furnishings and the obvious signs of prosperity. "And these men are treating you with proper respect?" "Absolutely. They've been nothing but kind and honorable." Samuel chose that moment to burst through the front door, his face flushed with excitement. "Miss Clara, we found 3 new calves in the south pasture. Pa says they're the prettiest babies he's ever seen." He stopped short when he saw the unfamiliar woman in the parlor. "Oh, hello, ma'am. I'm Samuel Mitchell." Elizabeth studied the boy with interest. "Hello, Samuel. I'm Clara's sister, Mrs. Hartwell." "Miss Clara's sister? That's wonderful. Are you going to stay here too?" "We're building a whole community, and Miss Clara says I might have cousins someday." Elizabeth looked at Clara with raised eyebrows. "Building a community?" Over the next 2 hours, Clara explained her vision for the ranch's future, supported by enthusiastic contributions from Samuel and respectful input from both Thomas and James when they joined the conversation. Elizabeth listened carefully, asking pointed questions about finances, practicalities, and long-term sustainability. Finally, she asked to speak with Clara privately. They walked out to the front porch, where Elizabeth could observe the ranch operations and get a sense of the place her sister was considering making her home. "Clara, I came here prepared to rescue you from what I assumed was a desperate situation," Elizabeth said. "But I can see that these are good people. And this is a prosperous operation. My question is, are you sure this unusual arrangement you're proposing will actually make you happy?" Clara had been asking herself the same question. "Elizabeth, in Boston, I was a seamstress working 6 days a week for barely enough money to rent a small room. I had no prospects for marriage, no opportunity to use my education, no chance to build something meaningful with my life. Here, I have the opportunity to help create something lasting, to make a real difference in people's lives. But what about love? What about marriage and children of your own?" Clara was quiet for a moment, watching Thomas and James work with the horses in the paddock below. "I won't lie and say I haven't thought about those things. but I've also learned that there are many different ways to build a meaningful life. If I can help create a community here, if I can serve as a bridge between families, if I can help Samuel grow up in a place filled with love and opportunity, then maybe that's a form of fulfillment that's just as valuable as traditional marriage. Elizabeth nodded slowly. And if one of these brothers decides he'd rather court you than seek a wife through correspondence? Then we'll deal with that situation when it arises, Clara said. But for now, I think the plan we've developed serves everyone's needs, including my own. That evening, Elizabeth joined the family for dinner, and Clara could see her sister evaluating every interaction. She watched Thomas's respectful attention to Clara's opinions, James's quiet kindness toward Samuel, and the boy's obvious happiness with his expanded family. By the end of the meal, Elizabeth's concerns had largely been satisfied. "I'll be staying in town tonight and traveling back to Denver tomorrow," Elizabeth announced. "But before I go, I want to say that I'm impressed with what you're all trying to build here. Clara, if this is truly what you want, you have my support." The next morning, as Elizabeth prepared to leave, she pulled Clara aside for a final conversation. "I brought something for you," she said, handing Clara a small wooden box. "It was Mother's engagement ring. I thought you might need it someday, but now I'm thinking you might prefer to save it for a future daughter or daughter-in-law." Clara opened the box and looked at the simple but elegant ring inside. "Thank you, Elizabeth. I'll treasure it. And Clara, write to me regularly. I want to know how this grand experiment of yours turns out." After Elizabeth's departure, Clara felt a sense of finality about her decision to stay at the Mitchell Ranch. Her 2-week trial period was nearly over, but she no longer needed the full time to make her choice. She had found something here that she hadn't even known she was looking for, a chance to build something meaningful, to use her skills and intelligence in service of a larger vision. That afternoon, she approached Thomas and James with her final decision. "I want to stay," she told them. "Not as a wife to either of you, but as a partner in building the community your father envisioned. I want to help you find good wives, help raise Samuel, and help create something that will last for generations." Thomas smiled with genuine happiness. "We'd be honored to have you as a permanent member of this family, Clara, in whatever capacity makes you happiest." James nodded his agreement. Pa would be pleased to know that his plan worked, even if it didn't work exactly the way he expected. Samuel, who had been listening from the doorway, let out a whoop of joy and ran to hug Clara around the waist. "So you're really staying forever? You're really going to be our family?" "I'm really staying, Samuel. This is my home now." That evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, Clara felt a deep sense of contentment. The elder Thomas's hidden trick had been more complex and far-reaching than any of them had initially understood. He had orchestrated not just a marriage, but the foundation for an entire community. His vision was about to become reality thanks to a Boston seamstress who had answered a matrimonial advertisement and discovered something better than she had ever dared to dream. The Mitchell Ranch would indeed become a community, just as the elder Thomas had hoped. And Clara Whitmore would be at its heart, helping to weave together the threads of multiple families into a tapestry strong enough to withstand whatever challenges the frontier might bring.